Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Prayers of Folly podcast. I'm joined again by Right Ruminations, and we're here to talk about was the past leftist? And he said that this question was also tied up in relationship to an earlier video we did on Twas Ever Thus. So why don't you go ahead and lay out the sketch of this question in the context in which it's asked?
This question of whether the past is leftist or not is something that arises in relation to people who are conservatives or on the right, or claim to be conservatives or on the right, who like to find commonalities with the past in a way that makes it look more leftist, and I suppose therefore gets them some degree of left-wing street credit. It's also used by leftists who want to disprove modern conservatives or right-wingers as not being in keeping with the past the way they say they are. I'll break this down into three groups, roughly speaking. One is the left socialist types. Noam Chomsky would be an example, who claim that the past and therefore conservatism is actually left-wing. And Chomsky will bring up examples of how the early American Republican Party had a kind of democratic socialist leaning, at least some part of it that he finds favorable. He will point out that the Jeffersonian Republicans at America's founding, or shortly thereafter, had a negative view of capitalism. That is, they actually said negative things about capitalism. He will also generally point out the overlap between the medieval system of economics and socialism in a way that's meant to sort of discredit modern right-wing thought as being a kind of innovation and not really having any connection with the past. This is also something that scholars routinely do with the question of race. And they'll say that a textbook I picked up the other day on history said race was invented in the modern Western world. You also find this on the dissident right to an extent, mainly with respect to economics. So you'll find people like Richard Spencer basically say that he likes the idea of something like Obamacare being used to unite white people, which is kind of ironic. You see the dissident right take up these questions of environmentalism and say, well, in the past, back when we had a unitary sense of peoplehood, we also had this tendency toward economic and ecological, what today would be thought of as leftism. And so for them, being on the left really, at least economically, means being on the right. Whereas for someone like Chomsky, it's just more cut and dry that the past was left, I suppose, in one form or another. Finally, you have what you've called in the title, the video's description, Rod Dreher Incorporated, which is more of the red Tory, high Tory, crunchy con variety, who do call themselves conservatives, but like to point out that modernity, or in their thinking, modernity, created race, created capitalism, created all of these right-wing aberrations, created individualism, let's say, and that if only the left knew that all of their most cherished ideals of community and economic justice and so forth were actually anticipated in Christendom and in the wisdom of ancient societies, that they would become fellow conservatives like Rod Dreher Incorporated. A final word on this is I always love that a lot of the staff at TAC, like Rod Dreher, will bend over backwards to disavow the Enlightenment, but then on the other hand, they bend over backwards to defend all of the most recent orthodoxies regarding anti-racism, anti-sexism, and so forth. So basically, this was the past leftist. It's a question of, was the past racialist? Was it pro-capitalist? or so proto-socialistic? And does the left or the right have a better claim to a serious antecedent in the past, in light of these claims of overlap between leftism and the past by these three subcategories I've just outlined?
Yeah, I remember I used to listen to so much Chomsky back in the day, but there was a discussion where he said that he was the real conservative. I'm like, whatever that means, Chomsky, because he never then tried to explain it. But that is a very Chomsky thing to do. I think all three of these examples are somewhat, what I think they all share in common is a sense of insincerity about them, where they're not really invested in understanding the past for its own sake, or for the sake in which it might help us avoid the mistakes of the past itself, but rather in order to sort of, if you will, proof text history in order to score points. And if somebody were really interested in learning from the past for solving contemporary problems, I would point to the founding fathers and the Constitutional Convention. Whether you like the Constitution or not, whether you think it ultimately worked or not, it doesn't really matter. What matters is that these men looked at the past in a very rigorous, analytical way in order to derive some useful theories and practice of government in the current age. Whereas these three groups, I don't see having that sincerity. I think it's more proof texting history to score points with the right group of people.
Well, since you brought up the example of Chomsky first as something to focus on, I think that Chomsky is a good case study for this, in that what he does is he takes a small number of commonalities between the past and the left, and then says, well, aha, therefore the past was the same as me, or at least he leaves the audience with that implication. So to take his favorite examples, American history. Well, first of all, there's the problem of assuming that American history is, that for some reason that things in early American life are necessarily conservative, is itself a strange claim. I don't know why one would look to the Jeffersonian Republicans or the early Republicans from the era of Lincoln and then say, okay, well, these people said that and therefore that's conservative. There's something kind of bizarre about that, just to begin with from the outset. But even if you grant that that's the case, I mean, it doesn't really fit with the context, because the Jeffersonian Democrats held to a very rigid interpretation of the U.S. Constitution, which Chomsky despises as an interpretation. That as we discussed in last week's episode, Madison vetoed his and Jefferson's own bill, which was just to provide some money for roads and canals. But supposedly because John Taylor or Jefferson said something bad about state capitalism as it existed in New England, that therefore they would be Obamacare supporters now, is quite a reach. Also, that thing that people love to quote from Jefferson, which I think is from his notes on the state of Virginia, but he writes it somewhere, that he would like federal spending for a university, a public university, but it's always omitted that that a few sentences later he writes, well, of course we'd need to acquire an amendment to the Constitution in order to make this legal. Well, obviously there's been no such prior amendment either for that or for roads and canals. And as for the example of the Republicans from Lincoln's era, well, first of all, they weren't conservatives. They were social radicals. And secondly, he would have to be focusing on a very specific subset of them because, of course, the Republican Party of Lincoln was largely big business, big government capitalists like Lincoln were. I mean, they were pro-protectionist, they were pro-banks, but they were associated with capitalism. That's sort of the advent of big capital in America. So that's another odd association. The final thing I'll say about Chomsky is that he then equates classical liberalism and conservatism and says, well, you know, the classical liberals, the conservatives, he's almost viewing it with the same kind of unitary congealment as a kind of low-grade Republican would. Like the way, that's almost like the way like Mark Levin or something would look at it, like look back and say, like, well, the classical liberals, conservatives, old-time Americans, you know, it's all the same thing. And then because you find like a handful of quotes that they were leftist, and then you ignore like the actual like proto-libertarian, like right libertarians in England, like Richard Cobden and Herbert Spencer, who were, you know, borderline anarcho-capitalist, but they don't exist. And that somehow there's this sort of true conservatism, classical liberalism that everyone believed in, and it was as American as apple pie. I'm not. If you've listened to as much Chomsky as you've said, you know this is no exaggeration.
Oh no, it's not. In fact, the anarchist Bob Black devotes a 20-page essay on raking Chomsky over the coals for many of the points you've brought up. The other scholar Chomsky loves to cite is Humboldt, and yeah. A real anarchist like Bob Black does not take too kindly to that.
No, that's quite right, and I think that it's important to note that Chomsky, that he's not alone in these views, right? I remember speaking to students, both graduate and undergraduate, who just assumed that simultaneously America's past, yes, it was sexist, racist, homophobic, all those evil things, but they could all agree that they were going in the same direction of social democracy and left-wing, you know, egalitarianism, because they didn't live up to it, but that's uniformly the direction in which they were interested. So not to provide too much of a tangent, but I do love the irony in Chomsky's case that on the one hand, you know, they were all bad because they were all slaveholding, white supremacist, what have you. But then they were also all proto-socialist Chomskyites. So square that circle for me if you can.
Well, the really weird thing here, Right Ruminations, is the one founding father that most closely fits this Frankenstein of Chomsky's imagination is brain fart, the guy that wrote Common Sense.
Oh, Thomas Paine.
Yeah, he went to France during the Revolution. He comes closest to fitting this. I mean, even he doesn't really fit it, but he comes closest. And even Chomsky doesn't even pick the right guy. But I'd like to hear your thought on the insincerity of it, because I really do think a lot of this is just born out of a insincerity to signal a certain way.
Yeah, it is, because when you hear these academics talk about this, I mean, it really does seem like it's more of a social point that they're making than an intellectual point. It seems like what they want to do is they want to say, well, you have these idiot Tea Party types who go around quoting the founding fathers and calling themselves conservatives or whatever, but wouldn't you know, they're so illegitimate that nobody agreed with them on anything in the past. So it's like this desire to somehow delegitimize your opponent's position historically, which, I mean, maybe to their credit, maybe in a sense Chomsky is some kind of radical right-winger, because his argument seems to be literally that it wasn't there before, therefore it's bad.
I know. And if you look at, you know, everybody's favorite "Twas Ever Thus or to Hate," Rod Dreher. especially with Rod Dreher, there's a deep amount of insincerity. I really think, and we've talked about this in the Twas Ever Thus episode, people like him and Milbank and Chronicles Magazine crowd, it's really, I think, a function of their social class. They're in a social class that happens to predominantly be left-wing progressive, and they, for whatever reason, are not atheists and still believe in religion. And so they have to sort of swim in that circle. And the way they do that is by saying that their religiosity is actually the proto-socialism that these people are advocating. And that if you were a real hipster, liberal, latte sipping, avocado toast eating progressive, you'd be Eastern Orthodox.
Yeah, that's an interesting point that you make, because it's sort of a double-edged sword. It's an attempt to, on the one hand, signal to the left that you are on the left, or in agreement with them on all their most important points. But it's also an attempt to one-up them and say, well, if you were truly what you say you are, then you'd be, like you say, Eastern Orthodox or Roman Catholic or what have you. So there is this kind of attempt to out-leftize the left. I think that it really is just also, speaking of the insincerity, I think perspective and the impression that a Rod Dreher, not so much Chronicles Magazine, in my thinking. I think Chronicles Magazine has a different set of issues. But they're now under the editorship of Paul Gottfried, and they used to have Tom Fleming. I don't know if they ever quite became Twas Ever Thusers. They never really went all that much for social acceptability. They have their own set of preoccupations. But the TAC, for example, the American Conservative, is a good example of sort of Rod Dreher Incorporated. And there is maybe the height of insincerity is that if you were living in the 19th century, they might have actually had a point. That if you say have black people who are a minority under societies that aren't overly fond of them, or if you have people working in the sweatshops, in the steel mills or whatever, and you have the society that goes around pretending to be Christian, but who would Christ really side with? He would side with the downtrodden, the oppressed economic worker, the minority, the oppressed minority, and so forth. And so it is a sort of ethos of the Good Samaritan, but that might have worked in the 19th century. It does not really work right now, because obviously to do that now is to side with the strong and powerful, and obviously to not recognize that is I suppose maybe the height of the insincerity of the Rod Dreher Incorporated orientation.
I think another group that really does fit into this category, and we talked about them in a separate episode, the Distributors review crowd. We briefly touched on the fact in another episode that they brought out this academic professional stork to throw down with Tom Woods because they were butthurt that Tom Woods wrote The Church and the Libertarian or something. And it was just like, they just reeked of this because, they wanted to be all like proto-socialist. They were talking about having a progressive income tax and the government, literally confiscating property to transfer it to, because government transferring property from one hand to another is a totally, conservative thing to do. But, they were trying to then put that into the Middle Ages was like proto socialist or something, because they had distributism, even though it was really feudalism. The people.
As a footnote, it just occurred to me that distributism might actually be more destructive than socialism, because at least with socialism, you have this situation where there's some kind of managerial oversight or some kind of centralization at the hands of people who have some kind of expertise, even if it is highly dysfunctional. I'm trying to imagine what would happen if everyone were just given a few acres of land. Like, what would happen to that land almost overnight? I mean, there's a good case that would actually be inferior to socialism, but I will make a distinction between the likes of Thomas Stork and what you've called the Distributist review, in that I have a lot more respect for people like the Distributist than somebody like Thomas Stork, because these online Distributists, even if they're non-racialist and even if they have a kind of glossed over version of the past, there's still a sense in which they're willing to talk to people like millennial woes. They're willing to talk to people who are not acceptable in polite society. Thomas Stork would never do that in a million years. So I do think that there is a distinction to be made there. But what I would say is that I think that these distributist types are very, very closely interlocked with the Dreirians. It's just a slightly different emphasis, where they have a little more integration with the more proximate culture of Toryism, maybe. I think that the Dreirians are more distinctly leftist, whereas I get the sense that those of a sort of distributist Catholic persuasion, maybe the distinction is that they possibly could be more persuaded to, vote for a Republican or something. And not that really matters at all to me, but I do think that there's a slight difference in the kind of political culture of distributism versus these Rod Dreher Incorporated.
Yeah. And I think the last group you mentioned were dissident right types. And yeah, you do get this kind of weird idea that like ancient, or medieval European monarchies were also nationalistic and socialist, even though, of course, monarchies were the mortal enemy of both socialism and nationalism. It's very bizarre.
Right. Well, of course, nationalism, socialism, and capitalism have not been around for that long. I mean, all of these things arise in a modern context, and obviously societies prior to modernity, they did have elements of capitalism, of course. It was trade that helped them develop. They did have a certain sense of exchange and just what happens when you put two people in a room, that they do make deals, they do kind of contract at least some sort of process of agreement with one another. And likewise, it is true that there was a certain degree of economic collectivism historically as well. There are, obviously, there's not a period in which they were all Ayn Randians or Misesian capitalists. So it is kind of like comparing apples and oranges. And of course, they predate the nation state. These things are much more sporadic in the past. They're much more erratic. They diverge in both the direction of bigness and smallness. You have these huge empires that span entire continents. You have these smaller communities within those, and these kind of parochial ties. And yes, they're definitely ethnocentric. They definitely are not race blind, but they're not nations, as it would come out of, say, the French Revolution. So there is this, certainly not nation states. So there is this tendency to also to do with economics, you might say, what distributists and Rod Dreher Incorporated and also the leftists do. I would say that the way I would distinguish it is this: that for Chomsky, the past was leftist, but also oppressive. For Rod Dreher Incorporated, the past was leftist, And the modern right is oppressive, but we used to be more have more noblesse oblige or something. And then for the dissident right, ethno-collectivist, they have the same disposition as the broad Dreher Incorporated, except on race, where they err in the opposite direction and act like in the past everyone thought about race in the same way that millennial woes does or something.
Yeah, now this gets to the actual question itself. If we look at left and right in the modern age, to what extent can we extrapolate these concepts in the past? And we've all gone through those who sat to the left of the French king and parliament were the left, those who sat to the right were the right. But even the Ancien regime itself was not ancient at all. It was the result of Cardinal Richelieu in the early 17th century, creating this all-powerful state, whereas before France had been this tension between the French king and the Pope, the French king and the nobles, and even further back, the French king and the English king. And I think what makes I think the two things that make modernity fundamentally different and disanalogous to the past is the fact that modern philosophy tends to be that man is perfectible. So in that regard, I do sort of agree with Russell Kirk. Both the fascists through eugenics, the socialists through environmental conditioning, and the capitalists through transhumanist reformation can perfect man into the ultimate being. And that's just really not a thing people thought you could do. They just, maybe you got lucky and became a god when you died, but not in life. You weren't, with a few exceptions, like if you were an emperor, maybe. But the idea of perfecting man to be this perfect, flawless being is really a modern concept. And then the other one is that, political organization should really be what's practical, not what's ideal. And then we get that with Machiavelli. And so I think that, of course, that idea, it leads into the scientific revolution because Francis Bacon, in one of his early writings, explicitly cites Machiavelli as an inspiration. And I think this is why it's disanalogous to look for modern, in scare quotes, modern concepts in the past, because modernity is in several key areas distinct, disanalogous. And I think it's this attempt to find presence of modernity in the past, without acknowledging the discontinuity, is evidence of what we might call, insincerity. These discontinuities you just don't really find in the ancient world. I mean, you don't try to use eugenics or cultural conditioning or transhumanism to perfect man. And this is sort of an outgrowth of the Renaissance, where Hermeticism is on the rise again. Mirandola writes his homage to man as God. And I think when you look at that, and then you look at Machiavelli, that's what I'm getting at. So what do you think about that, Right Ruminations?
Could you refresh me on the point that was being made when I fell out?
Yes, the point that the TLDR is the present is in at least two areas I think fundamentally disanalogous to the past. One, these new ideologies believe man is perfectible. Fascism through eugenics, the socialism through environmental conditioning, and capitalism through transhumanist technological development. Yeah.
Yes, so I remember. I think that is true, and that Nietzsche did have a point on this, that if there's something very different about the past, it's that they probably did not think about change in the same way. That is, even conservatives talk about the need for change. And I really don't think that the past necessarily conceived in terms of this sort of teleological understanding of itself, which is most likely post-Socratic. That's not to say anything about whether it's good or bad. It's simply, is. But I will say that just on the face of it, the left or the past, by definition, if you're using the most obvious or the most universal definitions, the past would have to be of the right, because it's the past in which the right is understood in reference to the past. And I mean this in the terms that you see with the assembly in the French Revolution, where it is kind of a older hierarchical society that has a certain dynasty and that has certain parochial traditions and so forth. That is the right wing, and then revolutionary innovation is left wing. I like to see right and left as being on a scale, a cosmic scale, where on the far right you have something like the Hindu caste system or the ancient Egyptian empire, and then on the left you have probably what some third wave feminist neo-Marxist gender studies professors' utopia would be. And so you have to view sort of all politics as along the scale. Now, if this is your cosmic scale, it's fairly obvious that the past was rightist in that respect. Now, the question is it rightist in a way that is relevant to today's right? And I think that this is where the grain of truth comes into the equation of the people who view the past as leftist, that yes, it was non-capitalist. And just by being non-capitalist, it does have certain commonalities with socialism. Yes, it was pre-science, and as pre-science, it did have certain commonalities with multiculturalism. But the problem is to then say that the past would therefore be on the side of modern anti-racialism, anti-capitalist socialism is a severe leap in logic, because those societies were not socialistic. They were highly economically hierarchical. They didn't have they were not universally enamored with some kind of egalitarian welfare state. There was a very clear distinction between poor and wealthy, permanent status structures built into society. And clearly, they thought in terms of ethnocentric norms. And a good example of this is the pharaoh Sesostris III, who had run-ins with the Nubians, who were, they were Northern African black people, essentially. And he erected a statue on the Nile that said no Nubians allowed past this point into Egypt. And I was reading a passage from an anti-racism book that had alluded to this. And they said something like, this is bad, but the pharaoh may have been motivated more by political considerations than racial prejudice. Now, there is just such a horrible case of special pleading in that. I mean, what if... I mean, it's an obvious example, but if Donald Trump committed even the most minor racial offense, would they ever for 2 seconds accept the excuse, well, it was motivated by political considerations rather than by racial prejudice? I think they would be asking the rather obvious, what's the difference? Because all racial prejudice, all behavior predicated on it is by definition political. So that's an example of the sort of extraneous nature of these conversations that these people are having. I think that overall, the past was economically collectivist, but in this sense, the ethno-nationalists or the dissident right probably have the best reading of the past in that respect, except for the part where they say, well, it was collectivist, therefore it was good. But I think that the past is like comparing apples and oranges when related to the present, because if you look at the African in the Arthurian legends, no one questions that it's a black man, but also no one really distinguishes that from the fact that he's African. It's kind of like saying that gender didn't, or sex didn't exist in the medieval period. Well, of course they didn't have a scientific understanding of sex or race as distinct from ethnicity or gender, because it didn't really have the same modern scientific method. They thought in terms of these kind of, holistic identities where they did not have the clean distinctions that people would look to today. There was a certain degree of primitivism involved. And I also think that the economics of the past look relatively similar. It was not a question of, do we support equality under the law versus equality of outcome? Well, of course, they didn't support any equality at all. They supported these different stations in society based on different positions of economic power that are relatively, though not completely, fixed. And that, of course, there's some degree of duty or noblesse oblige written into the fact that some people had so much economic power. So on the one hand, the past was right wing in a universal sense, but it's also not really directly comparable to today's right wing because it was an entirely different world, which kind of brings us full circle to that insincerity that you're talking about, because they're looking at this impossible comparison of this entirely different world and then finding the ways that it isn't like your opponent and then saying, aha, it's just like us.
Yes. I think one element to backtrack a little bit about how the past is different than the present modern era is highlighted very well from a brief excerpt from a blog called Utopia and Dystopia, The Man Who Invented the Future, about Joachim of Fiora, the 13th century Catholic mystic. And the author of this blog entry writes, medievals lacked a notion of what we would understand as an impersonal future that would be different from the past. It wasn't as if a person living then would lack the understanding that their own personal tomorrow would be different than today, that their children would age and have children of their own, and that the old would die. It was that there was a little notion that the world itself was changing. It would be a tough sell to get the medieval to pay for a trip into the future, for in their view, whether you travel 100 or 1,000 years forward, everything would be exactly the same, unless that is the world wasn't there to visit at all. Being a medieval was a lot like being on death row. You knew exactly how your life will end. You just wouldn't know when exactly you ran out of appeals. A medieval Christian had the end of the story in the book of Revelation, and its characters such as the Antichrist and the scenes such as the Battle of Armageddon. A Christian was always on the look for the arrival of all the props for the play that would be the end of the current world. And if they believed in any real difference between the present and the future, it was that the world in which these events were to occur would be what we would consider less technically and socially advanced than the Roman world into which Christ had been born. History for the medievals, far from being the story of human achievement, was instead the tale of societal decay. We will, before actual events on the ground, improvements in human living standards, technological capacity, and scientific understanding undermine this medieval idea of the future as a mere decadence before a final ending. Joachim would do so philosophically and theologically. And I think this is really the key thing, because if you look at the Hebrew scriptures, the Jewish scriptures, the Hindu scriptures, Plato, Confucius, all of these people view the present age as a decline, as a fall from grace, from a perfected state of man. And Plato in the Republic has the story of the men of gold, who were the perfect men. And whereas the modern age starts with imperfection, and out of chaos we get order. We create this perfect future world. So I think that cosmic outlook that you were speaking of, if we flesh it out a little bit more, I think really is the key dividing aspect, The conservative looks to a past golden age, or the right-winger that we fell from and that will be restored through some sort of, hermetic, alchemical, or theological process. And the modern world, the left, looks at a crappy world now that was always crappy, and that will be perfected through human reason and the environment.
Well, in this respect, it may very well be that someone like Chomsky is to the right of myself, if we're working on that particular assessment. What I would say is that this I agree with on the face of it, but I would also like to make note that I think that it speaks a little bit more to the innate psychology of humans than the author that you're quoting from may be fully forward about. What I mean is that I think that the majority of humans are hardwired to think in terms of what will always be. And when things do change, I've noticed this with my interactions with people. They act as though it was always the way that it is now changed to be, even in their lifetime. So I'll speak to older people.
Oh, yeah, totally. Go ahead.
And they will either act like now is the same as it was when they were young, because they can't fathom that things have changed, or they will act like what they believe now is what they always believe. So if you have an old person who's trying to virtue signal as being anti-racist, they will act like A, it's still the 1950s when they remember actual racism, and B, they always had the heroic leftist stand that they have now. And you see the same sort of language in just a while ago, before things got very very radical, before things got as exciting as they are, let's say, post-Trump, that there was this almost sense that things would never break down from the post-World War II consensus. If you were to turn on Fox News or CNN, you'd get the sense that somehow the world will always be the world created by Harry Truman and the Nuremberg trials. And now that it's changed in favor of the sort of radical identity politics, one gets a sense that a lot of people think that somehow that's the world that they were always living in. And I have to wonder if this is less of a dichotomy with how people were in the past, so much as it is that modern people just don't acknowledge that they're exactly the same in that respect, because humans are simply predisposed to believe that what is has always been and always will be, when in fact it has been changing throughout all of history.
Yeah, I could see that. Another element to this discussion of nuance and sincerity, when you look at history from the point of view of these more modernist ideologies, they take on this Manichaean quality where, your side, i.e. the good side, has no flaws, and the other side, i.e. the bad side, has all the flaws, and you get these very one-sided accounts. Whereas what's striking is if you read, even the quote-unquote history plays of Shakespeare, or actual historians like Polybius or Tacitus or, Anna Comnenia, there's much more nuance onto who's good or bad. In fact, I think what was really interesting is what was being striven for with classical history. Polybius, I'm paraphrasing, states that it's not to be expected that one man is always in the wrong or always in the right. That he's sometimes in the wrong and sometimes in the right, and therefore a historian must be sensitive to that criteria. And he goes even further and says that as a historian, one's primary loyalty is to the truth, which means one must speak well of enemies and ill of friends if their actions deserve such a report. That way of thinking, you just never see in modern day scholarship. I think the last time you found anything close to that was John F. Kennedy's Profiles in Courage, where there was actually a disclaimer where it said, even though we don't approve of the political stances of every individual in this book, we approve of the courage of their convictions. Like, you can't imagine that being written or said today.
I think that this really is the curiosity involved in these folks, is that there's an irony where they actually are methodologically right-wing, even though they have a misassessment of the past as being leftist, and even though they are on board with all of the leftist policies, there's still a sense in which they really are kind of resorting to the sort of justifications that you find in an actual right-winger like Julius Evola, where there is a tendency that he looks back and he delegitimizes the present as being that which is distinct from the past, and that there's been this essential break that's been made, and that we've passed into this kind of turn towards the illegitimate. I remember hearing Mark Citadel talk about how nothing has ever been like this before, that we've entered into this kind of degradation of Kali Yuga, which is a more severe iteration than what has ever been experienced before. The odd thing is that you have leftists trying to delegitimize right-wingers in the presence because they are not in line with what they believe to have been the line preferred by this or that figure in the past. And it all becomes very confusing because you have leftists reading the past in favor of themselves and therefore trying to smear their right-wing opponents as being somehow cosmically illegitimate, but then at the same time claiming that somehow the left is historically oppressed or is standing with the disadvantaged party, simultaneously saying that it was actually in step with history the entire time. And so you get these very convoluted mixed signals that it makes it borderline impossible to actually sort the whole thing out, because it's not even trying to iron out its own contradictions.
No, exactly. And one point you made earlier that I want to touch back on is this, what I call massive long-term memory deletion. And I've been thinking about this in a lot of ways too as well, both in the sense that people who I've known personally will just, their thoughts of other people that maybe we didn't like, but then they learn to like, I guess, for whatever reason, they'll just forget all the bad things that ever happened. And I'm like, wait, you remember we used to talk about how bad that person was? They don't even remember. And it's just like, what? Or as you said, it was something much more grander in scope. Their position, how things haven't really changed at all. Like this ludicrous idea that the past was always full of horny people banging each other all the time, like today, even though that would have led to massive STD outbreaks that would have been uncontainable, even 100 years ago, even 60 years ago. And so, no, that's ludicrous. It reminds me of an anecdote where Peter Hammond, a South African missionary, was able to actually talk to Nelson Mandela before he died. And Mandela asked him, were you resisting the apartheid regime when I was in prison? And, he basically said, well, sort of, but not for the reasons you think. I wasn't really fighting for you, Mandela. And Mandela was like, finally an honest white man, because I see all these white people and I'm like, oh, we were always rooting for you, Mandela. We were always on your side. And he's like, well, if you were always on my side, why did it take so long to overthrow the regime? And I'm like, exactly. I think that little Mandela anecdote perfectly sums up what you're saying.
Yes, I think that it definitely is a situation wherein there is a ready-made answer, but the ready-made answer is so implausible that it becomes difficult to speak of it in a neutral way, even though I like to strive to speak about things in neutral ways. There's a temptation to be very glib about it. And let me give you an example of why. Let's say that what you are speaking about is Shakespeare, and the topic of racial sensitivities in Shakespeare and its relation to the concerns of modern identity politics. You have a bit of a problem, because on the one hand, as a good Shakespeare scholar, you will want to say that Shakespeare, of course, has racial problems in it. As we can see that at the end of Much Ado About Nothing, one of the characters who's pledged to marry this mystery woman says, "I would marry her even if she were an Ethiop." And so you'll have to have your little footnote for that, saying that this is the part of the ethnocentric, Eurocentric, European mindset in Shakespeare's time, which shows that, you know, how we've come a long way, but also this is part of the bedrock of our flawed system. So that's the first thing that you have to note, is that Shakespeare is the basis of modern racism. That's just how far our racial consciousness is rooted. However, on the other hand, you also have to show that your hero Shakespeare was not a racialist, because, of course, race didn't exist back then. So you'll also have to sort of prove why Othello was not a Moor, why he was actually black, African. So you can kind of point to, well, there was this one picture of him where he looked sort of black. So, you know, Shakespeare, of course, would not have known race or cared about it. And you've asked, well, what gives? So why is he a racist in Much Ado About Nothing, but in Othello he's a multiculturalist, with a you know, strong, empowered black protagonist? And it seems to be that, well, he was just being ethnocentric in Much Ado About Nothing, but as ethnocentric, but also anti-racist. And he just hadn't worked out that distinction the way we have in modern political science. So he was sort of halfway there. And when you realize that this is unironically the way Shakespeare textbooks actually analyze that issue, it becomes very difficult to take seriously.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I guess since we're getting into the final statements phase, the past was sincere, the present is insincere.
Well, the past was sincere about those things which the present is insincere about, but I'm sure that the past had all kinds of insincerities of its own. I think that would be part of any realistic assessment, but I'm happy to close my case there.
All right. Thank you, Right Ruminations. This is Todd Lewis of the Prez of Holly podcast, signing off.